"He's just an old janitor, nothing special. Don't let him embarrass you at the reception." That was the sentence that changed everything. Not shouted, not delivered with any real cruelty in the tone, just my son's voice, low and hurried, aimed at his new district superintendent in a school hallway, describing 31 years of my working life as something to be managed rather than mentioned. But we'll get there. 6 weeks after that afternoon, I was sitting in the front row of a small auditorium, watching the same superintendent hold up a framed photograph he'd found buried in decades-old district archives, asking the room, in a voice suddenly thick with emotion, whether anyone present could confirm the identity of the young soldier in the image. And I remember the exact moment my son's face went pale, watching his own father stand up, slowly, from that front row seat, to answer a question nobody in that room had expected the janitor's chair to hold the answer to. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where this really begins. My name is Leonard Voss. I'm 74 years old. I live alone now in a small apartment above what used to be a hardware store, a few blocks from Fairview High School, the school where I worked as head custodian for 31 years, from 1985 until my retirement 6 years ago. My wife Ruth passed 8 years back, not long before I finally hung up my keys for good, and the two events, so close together, still sit in my memory as a single long season of loss, rather than two separate ones. I spent my working life keeping that school running in the quiet, unglamorous way custodians do, fixing broken lockers, waxing floors before graduation, being the first one there on snow days and the last one to leave after every dance and football game. Generations of Fairview kids knew me simply as Mr. Voss, the janitor, the man who kept a peppermint jar on his cart and always seemed to know exactly which door was sticking that week. My son Derek grew up in that same school district, walked those same hallways as a student while I mopped them as an employee, and eventually built his own career in education, working his way up from a teaching position to, eventually, an assistant principal role at a different school across town. A career path he pursued, I've come to understand, partly out of genuine passion for the work, and partly, I suspect, out of a quiet, lifelong desire to occupy a different position in a school building than the one his father had occupied for 3 decades. Here's the thing about me that Derek grew up mostly not understanding, even though the evidence of it sat quietly in a small metal box in my apartment closet his entire life. Before Fairview, before Ruth, before I became simply Voss from maintenance to 3 decades of students and staff, I served 2 years in the Army, including 11 months in Vietnam, during which I was wounded twice in combat. Once by shrapnel during a mortar attack that killed the man standing beside me, and once more seriously, during an ambush a few months later, that left me with a permanent limp I've spent 50 years explaining away as an old knee injury, whenever anyone asked. I was awarded the Purple Heart for those wounds, the medal itself sitting quietly in that metal box alongside my discharge papers and a handful of photographs from a war most people, by the time I came home, had already decided they wanted to forget. When I came home in 1969, I made a decision, the same decision a great many men of my generation made in those years. The country wasn't kind to returning Vietnam veterans, and I didn't want to spend my life explaining a war and a wound to people who'd already formed strong opinions about both before I ever opened my mouth. I took the custodial job at Fairview not long after Ruth and I married, and I simply didn't discuss those 11 months very often. Not out of shame, but because silence, in those years, felt like the safer and simpler choice for a young man trying to build an ordinary life. Derek grew up knowing, vaguely, that his father had been in the service, the way a child knows a fact without understanding its actual weight. He never asked many questions, and I never volunteered many answers, and somewhere in that mutual silence, the truth of those 11 months slowly faded into something closer to background noise than family history. I want to be careful here, because I don't think Derek was ever intentionally cruel to me. But as he built his own career in education, moving through faculty meetings and administrative circles where credentials and titles carried real social weight, I noticed, over the years, a certain carefulness enter the way he described me to colleagues. Not dismissive exactly, but managed, softened into something simpler and smaller than the truth. My dad worked maintenance at Fairview for 30 years. He told a group of fellow administrators at a conference I happened to overhear about secondhand, through a colleague who mentioned it to me later, not realizing the comment might carry any weight. Good, honest work. Kept that building running better than half the admin staff, honestly. The comment wasn't unkind. It also managed to compress 31 years of my working life into a single, tidy sentence that Derek clearly felt comfortable delivering without any further elaboration. There was a district holiday gathering a few years back where a fellow administrator asked Derek, in my presence, what his father had done before retiring, and Derek answered, "Custodial work over at Fairview, actually. If you can believe it, my old man kept that whole building standing basically single-handedly," a description accurate on its surface, but delivered in a tone that positioned my career as an amusing family footnote rather than a life's work worth genuine respect. There was a parent-teacher conference night, a couple of years into Derek's own administrative career, when a fellow assistant principal mentioned, casually, that her own father had been a doctor, and asked Derek about his family background in turn. "Oh, nothing quite that impressive," Derek said, laughing lightly. "My dad mopped floors for a living. Salt of the earth, but not exactly a dinner party story." The comment wasn't said with malice. It also managed, efficiently, to close the subject before anyone at that table had reason to ask a single further question. There was a summer barbecue, the year after that, where Derek introduced me to a group of his colleagues as, my dad, retired now, spent his whole career in maintenance work, a description that prompted one guest to ask, kindly, what that work had actually involved day to day, and Derek answered for me, quickly, before I could speak, moving the conversation toward a story about his own recent promotion instead. There was an afternoon, about a year ago, when I stopped by Derek's school to drop off a book he'd left at my apartment during a visit, and I overheard him through his office door, on the phone with someone, saying, "Yeah, my dad. He's a great guy. Just, pretty simple background. Janitor his whole career. Definitely not the academic type." I stood in that hallway for a good 10 seconds, holding a book I'd walked across town to deliver, listening to my own son describe 31 years of keeping a school building running and 2 combat wounds he didn't even know about as pretty simple background. And then I knocked, handed him the book, and asked how his semester was going. He never knew I'd heard a word. I want to be clear about something. I wasn't angry at Derek in the way people are angry at strangers. Derek loved me, in the specific, distant way of a son who has decided, over years, that a simplified version of his father is easier to present to a professional world increasingly concerned with credentials and titles. I don't think he ever consciously decided to be ashamed of me. I think, slowly, without either of us quite noticing, Dad, the janitor, became a smaller box than the actual man ever fit inside. What none of us knew, not Derek, not the new district superintendent, and certainly not me, until that afternoon in the hallway, was that the district's incoming superintendent, a man named Dr. Frank Halloway, had spent months, as part of a broader district history project, digitizing decades of old Fairview archival photographs, including a box of materials donated years earlier by a retired history teacher who'd apparently kept informal records of school staff and community members over the decades, including, it turned out, a faded photograph and an old newspaper clipping I had entirely forgotten existed, a local paper's brief mention, from 1969, of a young Fairview area veteran named Leonard Voss receiving the Purple Heart, printed alongside a small photograph of me in uniform that a neighbor had apparently submitted to the paper without my full knowledge at the time. I didn't know any of that yet. What I knew, 6 weeks before that auditorium moment, was that Derek had asked me to attend a small district reception honoring long-serving Fairview staff, myself included, a gesture I appreciated, if a little warily, given how our relationship around the subject of my career had settled into its familiar, comfortable smallness over the years. Arriving at that reception, I overheard Derek, in the hallway just outside the auditorium, speaking quietly to Dr. Halloway, who I gathered was meeting me for the first time that afternoon. "That's my dad over there," Derek said, gesturing toward me. He's just an old janitor. Nothing special. Don't let him embarrass you at the reception. He can be a little quiet, doesn't always know what to say in these kinds of settings. I want to be honest about what that comment cost me, standing close enough to hear it clearly, because I think it matters more than anything that happened afterward. 31 years of keeping that school running, a war wound I'd carried in silence for 50 years, and in that hallway, to a man he'd just met, my own son had reduced all of it to a warning. Don't let him embarrass you. I said nothing. I found my seat in the front row, the way I'd been directed to, and I waited for the reception to begin, carrying that sentence quietly, the way I'd carried a great many things quietly over the decades. I want to describe what happened next exactly as it occurred, because it's the moment everything changed, and it began without me saying a single word to start it. Dr. Holloway, partway through his remarks honoring the district's long-serving staff, held up a framed photograph he explained had come from the archival project, describing it as an image that's been sitting in our district files for over 50 years, of a young local veteran who I believe may actually still be connected to this school district. He read the faded newspaper clipping aloud, a brief account of a Purple Heart recipient named Leonard Voss, wounded twice in Vietnam, home now and settling into civilian life in the Fairview community. The auditorium had gone quiet. Dr. Holloway looked up from the clipping, scanning the room. Is there any chance, he asked, that anyone here today might know what became of this young man, whether he's still with us? I stood up, slowly, from my seat in the front row. That would be me, I said. I want to tell you honestly what happened in me in that moment, because I think it matters. Something that had been quiet and folded away for over 50 years opened its eyes. Not with pride exactly, but with a kind of tired, unexpected clarity. The specific stillness of a man who has spent decades deciding, deliberately, that certain kinds of recognition simply weren't necessary to an ordinary good life. Dr. Holloway's expression shifted from surprised curiosity to something far more serious. Mr. Voss, he said, you're the Leonard Voss in this photograph? I am, I said, though I imagine most people in this room know me better as the fellow who used to fix the lockers. A ripple of nervous, uncertain laughter moved through the room, quickly replaced by a heavier silence as Dr. Holloway crossed the stage, still holding the framed photograph, clearly working through the same recalibration I'd watched happen to so many people over the years, once the full shape of a quiet life finally came into view. Mr. Voss, he said, I had no idea, when I started this archival project, that I'd find a Purple Heart recipient still working, or having worked, until recently, in our own maintenance department. This is an extraordinary piece of our district's history, and I'm frankly a little embarrassed we never knew it while you were still on staff. Most people never had a reason to ask, I said. I wasn't in the habit of volunteering it. Can you tell us anything about what happened? Dr. Holloway asked, gently. Only what you're comfortable sharing, of course. I looked out at that room, full of teachers and administrators who'd known me, for decades in some cases, only as the man with the peppermint jar on his cart. I was wounded twice in Vietnam, I said, once by shrapnel during a mortar attack that took the life of the man standing beside me. Once during an ambush a few months later that left me with a limp I've spent 50 years calling an old knee injury. I came home, took a job at Fairview, and decided that was enough of a life without needing to explain the parts that came before it. The room was very quiet. I looked out at the room and found Derek's face among the crowd. He had gone very pale, standing near the back where he'd positioned himself, I realized now, specifically so he wouldn't have to sit near me during the reception. Dad, he said, his voice carrying across the quieting room, why didn't you ever tell me any of this? I want to answer that question honestly, the way I answered it that afternoon, because I think it matters more than the medal itself. Because I didn't want you growing up feeling like you had to measure yourself against an old war wound, I said. I wanted you to know me as your father, the man who showed up to your baseball games and fixed your bike, not as whatever that old clipping says about me. That felt like the more important thing to be, Derek. It still does. That's not why I never asked, though, Derek said, working his way toward me through the crowd now, his voice unsteady. I never asked because I let Janitor, simple background be the whole story, because it was easier to explain to people than actually sitting with real questions about who you were before I existed. Dr. Holloway, sensing the moment shifting into something more personal than ceremonial, quietly wrapped up the formal presentation, but the room's attention stayed fixed on the two of us for what felt like a very long time afterward. Derek drove me home himself that evening, and the car was quiet for a long while before either of us spoke. "I called you just an old janitor in that hallway," he said finally, to a man I'd just met. I've replayed that sentence in my head about 50 times since Dr. Holloway held up that photograph. "I heard it," I said. "I was standing closer than you realized." He was quiet for a long moment, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. "I'm not going to pretend that doesn't make this worse," he said. "I need you to know I heard myself say it too. Eventually, once the shame set in. I just wish I'd heard it the first time, standing in that hallway, instead of needing an archival photograph to force the realization." "Why do you think you said it?" I asked, genuinely curious rather than accusatory. "Because somewhere along the way, I decided your job was something to manage in professional settings, rather than something to be proud of," he said. "I've spent my whole career around people who talk about credentials and titles like they're the only currency that matters, and I think I let that infect how I introduced my own father, without ever consciously deciding to be ashamed of you." The weeks that followed were their own kind of complicated. There's a version of this story where the auditorium is the climax and everything after is a footnote, but that's not how these things actually resolve, and I want to be honest about that. Real resolution is slow. It's Derek calling more often, asking careful, genuine questions about those 11 months, questions that required sitting with answers, that didn't resolve neatly into simple, comfortable stories. It's Dr. Holloway inviting me to speak, informally, to a group of current Fairview students about my service. An invitation extended with considerably more humility than the "don't embarrass yourself" hallway comment had shown. There was an afternoon, about a month after the reception, when Derek asked if he could see the Purple Heart itself, the actual medal, still sitting in its small metal box. I brought it down to my kitchen table and set it out, and he sat looking at it for a long time before he spoke. "Why'd you keep it in a box instead of displaying it somewhere?" he asked. "Because for most of my life, I wasn't sure I wanted to look at it every day," I said. "The man standing next to me during that mortar attack didn't come home, Derek. This medal isn't a trophy. It's a reminder of an afternoon I've spent 50 years trying to carry quietly rather than perform." "I've spent years being a little embarrassed by your job," he said, "and this whole time you were also carrying something like this, silently, in a box in your closet. And I never once asked the right questions to find out." "Most people don't think to ask," I said. "That's not a criticism specific to you. Loud credentials get mentioned at conferences. Quiet ones get carried without comment, sometimes for 50 years. I watched my son, in the weeks after that, do something I hadn't fully seen him do before. I watched him stop letting the simplified version of me stand uncorrected. At a subsequent district event, when a colleague asked, casually, about his father's background, Derek answered, without hesitation, "My father spent 31 years keeping Fairview running as head custodian, and before that, he served in Vietnam, where he was wounded twice and awarded the Purple Heart." I spent way too many years only mentioning the first part. I didn't feel triumphant when the whole situation finally settled. I want to be honest about that too. I felt tired, the particular tired that comes after finally setting down a story you'd carried quietly, mostly alone, for over 5 decades. I thought about Ruth a great deal in those weeks, what she would have said, watching our son finally ask the real questions we'd both quietly hoped he'd get around to eventually, watching Derek learn to sit with a more complete version of the father who raised him. I think Ruth would have been proudest not of the auditorium moment itself, but of the quiet kitchen table conversation that followed it. It's been almost a year now. Derek calls every week, real conversations rather than brief obligatory check-ins, and he visits most months. And we sit at my small kitchen table and don't always talk about anything important, which is its own kind of gift after a year like that one. Dr. Holloway and I exchange occasional emails now, an odd correspondence neither of us expected to develop after that reception. I spoke to a group of Fairview students last spring, sharing more of those 11 months than I'd discussed with anyone outside my own family in decades. Standing in the same building where I'd spent 31 years quietly emptying trash cans and waxing floors, this time as a guest of honor rather than the man in the maintenance closet. Last month, Derek asked if he could go through the old metal box properly, not out of urgent curiosity, but out of genuine interest in knowing his father more completely. He sat with the discharge papers and old photographs for a long time. "Why'd you keep all of this hidden for so long?" he asked, not just from colleagues or from Dr. Holloway, from me. "Because I didn't want you to know your father as a wounded soldier first," I said. "I wanted you to know him as the man who showed up to your games and helped with your homework. I still do. The soldier survived something terrible. The father was for making sure you never had to carry the weight of that afternoon alongside me." He looked at the old discharge papers a long moment, then up at me. "You could have been both the whole time," he said. "I just never asked the right questions, and I let the simple version feel easier than the real one, for way too long." I think about that often now. How much of the people we love we simply never fully see, not because they're hiding on purpose, but because we've already decided, quietly and long ago, what shape we expect them to take, or because a simpler description is easier to offer at a professional conference than a complicated, painful truth. Derek looked at me for years and saw an unremarkable retired janitor with nothing particularly noteworthy behind him. He wasn't entirely wrong that I preferred an unremarkable life. He was wrong about nearly everything else. Some evenings now, I sit by my apartment window and think about how strange the shape of a life turns out to be. I spent 31 years being a man very few people fully understood, not because I hid it out of shame, but because I never once thought it needed announcing, and because the version of me that mattered most, always, was the one who showed up, day after day, to keep a building running for other people's children. Ruth used to say I carried that war the way some men carry a limp they've simply learned to explain away. Not hidden exactly, just quietly folded into the ordinary texture of a life that had more important things to attend to. I don't regret the years of staying quiet about the Purple Heart. I want to say that plainly, because I know some people hearing this will wonder why I let my own son describe me so smally for so long. I'd do it again, in most respects. Every simplified description, every year Derek grew up thinking of me as simply the janitor, rather than a man who'd survived something significant. I would trade all of it again for a son who loved me first, for showing up to his baseball games, and only later, on his own timeline, for whatever that old medal represented. That's what a father owes his son the way I see it, not a legacy to perform, a steadiness that doesn't require an audience. What I do regret, if I'm honest, is not finding a gentler way to tell Derek myself, before an archival photograph and a hallway comment forced the timing in front of an entire auditorium. I thought quiet humility was a form of protection, and in many ways it was. But I've learned, watching my son finally ask the real questions and correct the simplified version himself at district events, that some truths deserve a quieter, more deliberate unveiling than the one circumstance handed us that afternoon. Derek mistook my quiet history for an unremarkable one, because I let him. I don't blame him for that. I built that impression myself, year by careful year, for reasons that made sense to me at the time. But I'm glad in the end that the truth finally had its say, however accidentally it arrived. If there's one thing I'd want you to take from all this, it's this. The quietest person doing the most unglamorous work around you may be carrying something far heavier and far more significant than you've ever imagined. Don't mistake someone's simple job title for the entirety of who they are. And don't wait for an old photograph to surface before you finally ask the people who quietly keep your world running the real questions about what they actually lived through. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone in your life who's underestimated the quiet ones. Somebody out there needs to hear it today.